Good day, brothers and sisters. Hope we are following this four-part series in celebrating the Heritage Month and the Aldersgate Day. This would be the third part. Last time, I shared some ideas, experiences, and events that evolved John Wesley's social illnesses that surround his society and live his faith with the Lord Jesus Christ. With unrelenting prayerful landscapes of change and through the years beyond its usual ministry to the immediate poor around him. With the people called enthusiasts, they shared how wonderful his plans are by influencing powerful persons, organizing societies, documenting positions, creating cures, schools, meetings, and publishing information to nourish their physical and spiritual life. All of this, the British Parliament, majority of its members were convinced to abolish the cruelty of slavery in their very eyes. That revolution happening in the Parliament headed by William Wilberforce was a force to reckon with. Now, majority of the British Parliament, who headed by John Howard, sees to it those prisoners will treat humanely. With the support of Wilberforce and Prime Minister William Pitt, influenced by John Wesley, Wesley's foresight that his country and the whole empire will totally abolish the evils of slavery. On this third part of my shared talk, we'll present a centuries-old debate since the Reformation era. Wesley's doctrine of contention ministry with Whitefield's entitled In Retrospect, Project 1738, Part 3, Wesley's and Whitefield Controversy. In the 17th century, the doctrinal disputes over predestination came to the forefront in the Netherlands, serving as a means to further divide Protestants and stir up dissensions. Originating with the seemingly contradictory theology of John Calvin and Jacobus Arminius, and the debate carried over into the 18th century and spread all over Protestant Europe and North America. Serving as an instrument of division in a time when fragmentation within Protestantism was at its peak, once again, the debate was brought to the forefront when it served as a divisive instrument between John Wesley and George Whitefield, sometimes referred to as the co-founders of Methodism. John Wesley and George Whitefield's disagreement surrounds the issue of predestination, led to a split within Methodism, and a break in the working relationship for a time. Whitefield held to the more traditional Calvinist perspective, whereas Wesley aligned more with the theology of Arminius, although his doctrine of predestination had a unique twist. In order to understand this controversy, a basic explanation of Calvinist and Arminian perspective is provided.
Calvinism compared to Wesleyan perspectives. John Calvin's position is based on the foundation laid by Augustine, while John Wesley believed in Arminius. John Calvin held the belief on total depravity, which means human beings are so affected by the negative consequences of original sin that they are incapable of being righteous and are always and unchangeably sinful. Human freedom is totally enslaved by sin, so we can only choose evil. On the other hand, Wesley believed that we are deprived. Human beings are sinful and without God, incapable or deprived on their own of being righteous. However, they are not irredeemably sinful and can be transformed by God's grace. God's prevenient grace restores to humanity the freedom of will. John Calvin held unconditional election for his position. For him, human beings can only choose evil. God, by his eternal decree, has chosen or elected some to be counted as righteous without any conditions being placed on that election. John Wesley believed in conditional election. God has chosen that all humanity be righteous by His grace, yet has called us to respond to that grace by exercising our God-restored human freedom as a condition of fulfilling election. John Calvin affirmed limited atonement. The effects of the atonement by which God forgave sinful humanity are limited only to those whom He has chosen. On the other hand, John Wesley affirmed unlimited atonement. The effects of the atonement are freely available to all those whom He has chosen, which includes all humanity, whosoever will. John Calvin advocated the idea of irresistible grace. The grace that God extends to human beings to affect their election cannot be refused, since God has decreed it. John Wesley favored irresistible grace. God's grace is free and offered without merit. However, human beings have been granted freedom by God and can refuse His grace. John Calvin upheld the idea of the perseverance of the saints. Since God has decreed the elect and they cannot resist grace, they are unconditionally and eternally secure in that election. John Wesley, on the other hand, upheld the idea of assurance and security. There is security in God's grace that allows assurance of salvation, but that security is in relation to continued faithfulness. We can still defiantly reject God.
These 5 points as the heart of Calvinism, Reformed tradition, actually developed from the Synod of Dordrecht in 1618 to 19 in response to the Remonstrants, followers of Jacob Arminius. 5 points that challenge Reformed orthodoxy, especially the double predestination of Theodore Beza, a follower of John Calvin. Calvin's theological system was broader, ranging than these 5 points. However, these points came to encapsulate the Calvinist Reformed position against Arminius and later John Wesley. Meanwhile, George Whitefield and John Wesley is a description of the tension, friendship, and strained relationship these two men had. In the occasion and background of Whitefield's letter to Wesley requires a few words of explanation. From the time of his conversion in 1735, almost the same year to where Charles Wesley accepted Christ, Whitefield had been profoundly conscious of a man's entire depravity, his needs of new birth, and the fact that God can save and God alone, describing an experience which occurred a few weeks after his conversion. And he wrote,
"About this time God was pleased to enlighten my soul and bring me into the knowledge of His free grace."
Nevertheless, before 3 months had elapsed, it began to be evident that there had not been the same doctrinal development of the Wesleys. The fact is that while John Wesley had his conversion in May 1738, accepted evangelical views on sin, faith, and the rebirth, he at the same time retained his pre-conversion opinions on the doctrines of predestination and the extent of the atonement. Their contentions traveled two continents, Europe and North America, to where transportation of ideas and missionary work was done. Between the North Atlantic Ocean was the obscurity of two different doctrinal perspectives. When he returned to England in early 1741, he found that many of my spiritual children will neither hear, see, nor give me the least assistance. Yes, some of them sent threatening letters. John Wesley had preached and published against the teaching of George Whitefield on predestination and total depravity. Wesley rejected Whitefield's Calvinist convictions and held that sinless perfection was obtainable in this life. Accordingly, a summary of Wesley's sermon on free grace based on Romans 8:23, when he was in Bristol in June 1739, said,
How freely does God love the world! The grace or love of God, whence cometh our salvation, is free in all and free for all. It is free in all to whom it is given. It is free for all, as well as in all.
Wesley notes the predestination controversy brewing, and particularly those who hear saying,
This is not the predestination which I hold. God did elect a certain number of me to be justified, sanctified, and glorified. Now all this will be saved, and none else.
but Wesley argues if you believe that,
God ordained them to this very thing. Then you hold predestination in the full sense, which has been above described.
some do not believe.
Even this, something that God would not decree any man to be damned. Is not this what you mean by election of grace? It comes in the end to the same thing. One part of mankind are infallibly saved, and the rest infallibly are elected. But if this is so, then is all preaching in vain. This then is a planned proof that the doctrine of predestination is not a doctrine of God.
This predestination doctrine
Tend to destroy several particular branches of holiness, such are meekness and love.
This doctrine
Tends to destroy the comfort of religion.
the full assurance of faith is the
True ground of a Christian's happiness. And it does indeed imply a full assurance that all your past sins are forgiven and that you are now a child of God. But it does not necessarily imply a full assurance of our future perseverance. Witness of the Spirit experience shows to be much obstructed by the doctrine of predestination. Assurance of faith, which this enjoy, excludes all doubt and fear.
Wesley finds predestination an
Uncomfortable thought.
predestination.
Directly tends to destroy our zeal for good works.
Predestination also has
A direct and manifest tendency to overthrow the whole Christian revelation.
in the same way, it makes the revelation
Contradict itself.
Christ died not only for those to be saved,
But also for them that perish. Why then are not all men saved? Whatever be the cause of their perishing, it cannot be His will.
predestination is a doctrine full of
Blasphemy.
the doctrine represents Christ as a
Hypocrite, a deceiver of the people, a man void of common sincerity.
the doctrine
Destroys all God's attributes at once. It overturns both His justice, mercy, and truth.
Wesley connects those who ascribe to predestination with those who
Represent God as worse than the devil, more false, more cruel, more unjust.
through Wesley claims to
Love the persons who assert it. He abhors the doctrine of predestination.
the devil would rejoice if this doctrine were true.
The decree is passed, and so it was before the foundation of the world. Ye cannot charge your death upon him.
The first hint that this doctrinal difference might lead to serious results occurs in a letter of Whitfield's to Wesley on June 25, 1739.
I hear, honored sir, you are about to print a sermon on predestination. It shocks me to think of it. What will be the consequences but controversy? If people ask me my opinion, what shall I do? I have a critical part to act. God enable me to behave aright. Silence on both sides will be best. It is noised abroad already that there is a division between you and me. Oh, my heart within me is grieved.
On July 2, 1739, Whitfield wrote further to Wesley on this subject, terminating his letter with another appeal.
Dear honored sir, if you have any regard for the peace of the church, keep it in your sermon on predestination. However, you have cast a lot. Oh, my heart, in the midst of my body, is like melted wax. The Lord directs us all.
On Whitfield's departure from England in August 1739 to America, Wesley immediately published his sermon in 1740, entitled Free Grace. It professed to be founded upon Romans chapter 8 verse 32 and was printed as a pamphlet in 24 pages. Annexed to it was a hymn by Charles Wesley on universal redemption. While Whitfield was in Georgia and even in South Carolina, after his contradicting letters to Wesley, was very active engaging politics with the government. A 1735 law banned slavery in the English colony of Georgia. The colony's trustees, or the government, considered slavery incompatible with the aims of their using their new colony to provide a subsistence living for England's poor and to provide a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. In the ensuing years, various parties linked the colony's failure to thrive and develop economically and their own failure to succeed within Georgia to the lack of an enslaved labor force. Whitfield's ardent proponent to legalize slavery in New England, particularly in the state of Georgia, to where he owns a vast tract of land of 1,600 square meter and for 70 Negro slaves to finance scholarship, and Bethesda orphan homes to where at that time has 24 orphans, as per slave valued at price of $160 to $342 from 1742 to 1815. In the early 18th century, slavery had been outlawed in Georgia. In 1749, Whitfield campaigned for its legalization, arguing that the territory would never be prosperous unless farms were able to be used slave labor. He began his fourth visit to America in 1751, advocating slavery, viewing its re-legalization in Georgia as necessary to make his plantation profitable. In 1750, the Board of Trustees relented to pressure and enacted what they considered a humane slave code. Evangelist George Whitefield and merchant James Habersham were both proponents of legalizing slavery in order to support the Bethesda Orphan Home, which they established near Savannah in 1740. Scholarship about Whitefield, Habersham, and Bethesda have minimized or ignored their significance in Georgia's transition to a slave colony. The previous literature on legalizing slavery in Georgia likewise neglect their role in the trustees' decision. Partially through his campaigns and written pleas to the Georgia trustees, it was re-legalized in 1751. Whitfield then purchased slaves to work at Bethesda Orphanage. To help raise funds or money for the orphanage, he also employed slaves at his Providence plantation. When Whitfield died, he passed his slaves to Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon. Whitfield has always respected Wesley as his spiritual father in Christ and addressed Wesley in his letters as "Honored Sir." Although Whitfield's evangelistic successes far outstripped that of his former instructor, he continued to show John Wesley great respect to the very end of his life, when he requested John Wesley preach the sermon at his funeral. In 1770, the 55-year-old Whitfield continued preaching in spite of poor health. He said,
I would rather wear out than rust out.
The next morning, Whitfield died in the parsonage of Old South Presbyterian Church, Newburyport, Massachusetts, on the 30th of September, 1770. And he was buried according to his wishes in the crypt under the pulpit of this church. John Wesley preached his funeral sermon and eulogy in London at Whitfield's request. Whitfield left almost 5,700 British sterling, of today's worth is 358,050.86 in Philippine pesos in 2020, excluding assets of 74 Negro slaves, more or less $300 each in 1770, approximately 22,200 US dollars of today's worth is 1.1 million. Philippine pesos in 2020, and 1,600 square meter land with more or less 8 structures in it in Savannah, Georgia. Friends, this is the end of my sharing. Watch out for the fourth and last part. Thank you very much. God bless you all.